I can take you back to the Dutch and so on. That decision that they're going to print money and buy financial assets and lend money to the government, which will also disperse money to the poor, to those who need money and the companies. That process has happened over and over and over again in history. And it means that, what do you hold during such things? You hold reflation assets. Doesn't mean inflation assets. What I mean is there's inflation in goods and services. Let's put that aside for a moment, but there's first the inflation in financial assets as those risk premiums are driven down and that liquidity is put into the system, and there's the competition for trying to get returns.
So let's talk then, Ray, about the limits of money printing. How long can this continue before central banks do run into the limits of their capacity to explode, as you say, the balance sheet and print money?
Well, the limiting factor has to do with the demand for that money and debt. In other words, what debt is, a bond, is a promise to receive a lot of currency. And so when it gives no good return or bad return, and there's a printing of a lot of currency, clearly it's not desirable relative to other things for private investors. However, the central bank can buy it too. And so the limit has to do with the limit of demand. And that limit of demand has to do with the central bank's purchases of that, because they can buy it and hence there's no problem. So you look at periods of time of where in history, where was the most of it that has ever taken place, and to try to define the limits. And the war years was an example. I think the most analogous period we're in now was 1930 to 1945. I'll explain the various ways that it was analogous, but more importantly, I'd like to deal with the question of the limits. And so you first had the Depression, and in that Depression, and when you hit zero interest rates, you had the printing of money and the buying of financial assets, and then you had a lot of fiscal policy, so programs that produced large deficits, which then were monetized by more of that. And then you went into the war years, and the war years, very similar to now in terms of the need for a lot of money and credit, produced an enormous amount of money and credit, but it was managed by the central bank in a way where they were de facto taking that on, and it produced, it was a good example of testing the limits of that. Now, we went into periods where, what is an alternative source of wealth? And as I say, it can be stocks, gold, it can be other assets. But those became the boundaries. What would happen in terms of this limit is if something transpired where the dollar as a reserve currency, the holders outside, made another market that was a better market. It could be gold, it could be stocks, or it could be an alternative currency, like we in the earlier session, which I listened into, China as a reserve currency. There will need to be an alternative